Well, welcome. Thank you all for coming. Stuart, my screen is shared. Is it visible?
Looks good.
Yeah, this is sort of the Zoom version of, is this on? Right. So I'm glad it's on. And thank you all for being here. I just want to start out by saying that, you know, for many people who have been working online, the last thing you want to be doing now is being online again. So I very much appreciate your coming. My students will tell you that stress and coping is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. Normally when I teach this class, we are not in a time of a global pandemic, but it seemed like there was certainly some lessons that we could bring to this. So that's my goal for today. I wanted just to start out with a little bit of information. So if you need to show off some vocabulary at a dinner table, virtual or otherwise at some point soon, you've got a little bit to go with there. So when we're talking about stress, there's several definitions, but the actual definition is a demand made on an organism, human or otherwise, that requires adaptation, adjustment, or coping. We typically think of stress as something that is negative, but you can see from the definition that that's not necessarily the case, that a negative response or difficulty is not necessarily part of the actual definition. When we think about our subjective experience of stress, we really think it really tends to be an event or something that we perceive as dangerous, as threatening, as urgent, or as important. And so that lets us, again, kind of expand beyond just things that are solely or inherently negative, like a pandemic, but it might include something that, you know, I have to get to my class on time, I have to get to a store before it closes, I want to invite someone for a date, right? So things that we think of as important or urgent become events that we experience as stressful, not just things that we think of as dangerous or threatening. So, you know, if you sort of reach back into your sort of, you know, earlier experiences, that we know that stressful events create what we talk about as a fight or flight response. And that's our sort of typical go-to physiological response to a perceived threat. My neuroscience colleagues and my biology colleagues will tell you that the information that's here is a pretty simplified version. But we're all kind of tired right now, so we're going to go with the simplified version, and I can certainly give people more information if you want more specifics. You know, the way that we often think about stress is we think about something in terms of our body's response as the general adaptation syndrome. So when we perceive an event as a stressor, we have this fight or flight physiological response, right? I'm mobilizing for action. There's something that I need to do. There's a response that I need to be able to generate. And so I'm mobilized. Am I freezing? Am I fighting? Am I leaving the situation? Whatever that is. But that alarm phase is really about an acute stressor. And it's not designed to take us through a long-term or a chronic stressor, right? This is sort of my response in the moment when the event is happening. What we know is that if the stressor continues, and many of the stressors in our life continue, they might be far more chronic than acute, we have a sort of phase of resistance where the body is staying on high alert in order to offset or respond to a stressor. And there's a whole host of physiological responses that our body has that help us do that. You know, the challenge for our body is responding the same way to, you know, needing to flee, you know, a tiger, or, you know, taking a psychology exam, right? That we have that same kind of mobilized physiological response, and we have to kind of get our brains online and our sort of frontal cortex online in order to be able to consider what the actual threat is. But what we do know is that if a stressor is continuing, we end up in a state of exhaustion. And I suspect I don't need to tell anybody here that right now, that we just feel depleted. We feel depleted physiologically, we feel depleted psychologically. When a stressor is short-term, we have some time to recover. But when a stressor is persistent or chronic or long-term, we need to find other ways to manage that sense of depletion. So what else do we need to know? We know stressors can be experienced as positive or negative, right? So a negative stressor is something that requires me to adapt or change when I don't necessarily want to. But I can also have positive stressors in my life, a musical performance, an athletic performance, an exciting event, you know, a move, things like that. And so again, it's not so much about the valence, positive or negative, but about what do I need to do? How do I need to change and adapt in order to respond? We also know that we have big stressors and smaller stressors. So we have bigger stressors are what we talk about as major life events. And that might be something like a large scale weather event, a tsunami, a hurricane, an earthquake. It's major life events that are more interpersonal. It's a birth, it's a death in a family, it's a move, it's starting college, it's finishing college, right? Sort of these things that we kind of think of as these major life markers. And we tend to believe that those are the stressors that create the most stress for us, right? The big things, it's not the small things. But if you've ever had the experience of feeling like you were being pecked to death by chickens, you know that it's oftentimes the smaller things that can be cumulative that we talk about as daily hassles that really can that really are what wears us down. And so that is when my alarm doesn't go off and I wake up late and then I can't find my keys and then my car doesn't start and then I'm low on gas and then I get to class late and then I don't have time for lunch and then I have to walk the dog, right? And so it's all of those very small things that add up that actually for most people most of the time contribute far more to an experience of stress than the major life events. And there's a couple different reasons for that. One is the major life events typically are, sometimes they're predictable, sometimes they're not, but at the very least, they often tend to be shared experiences. So when we're all in something together, that can help mitigate the experience of stress in a way that when I'm the only one dealing with all of the small hassles in my life is a much more individual kind of thing. We know that stress creates physiological responses and psychological responses. So in times of chronic stress in particular, people will experience somatic symptoms, pain, headaches, neck and back pain, stomach pain, chest pain, sort of difficulty breathing or a sense of hyperventilating. Other kinds of physiological responses might be some GI distress. People talk about a feeling of like a knot in their stomach or butterflies in their stomach or nausea. Tiredness, reduced immune functioning, right? All of those are some of the physiological responses we have to stress. But we know that we also have a range of psychological responses. So that might be a sense of irritability or anger or difficulty managing my anger. It might be a sense of low frustration tolerance, right? I cannot take one more thing and then one more thing happens. It might be feelings of depression or sadness. It might be feelings of anxiety or fear. But it also might be a sense of being distracted, of having difficulty paying attention, of having difficulty remembering things. So all of those can be some of the responses, and people often have a fairly individual response, but they have a sense that they know what that is, and people generally will be able to tell you how they respond when they're stressed. But we also know that stressors can be perceived as either a threat or a challenge, and that's a really important distinction. So when I perceive a situation as a threat, that's a situation or a stressor where I'm not sure that I have the resources or skills that I need to cope with that, or I don't believe that I have them, or I don't know if I can access them. The same situation can be perceived as a challenge. And if I have a situation or a stressor that feels more like a challenge than a threat, it is still requiring adaptation, it is still requiring change, it might still be negative. I might even still have some of these same physiological or psychological responses. But what I know is that I believe that I have the skills and the resources that I need to meet that stressor head on. And we'll talk in a little bit later about how important that perception can be. So that's your overview of stress in a general way. But what we're really here to talk about is stress and the coronavirus, or stress and COVID-19. So I'm going to state some very obvious things that you all know. And one is that this is a stressor that is a negative event. It is not a positive event, right? We know that it's actually a threat to health and well-being, and that's a serious threat, and it's a real threat. We also know that perceptions of the seriousness of that threat vary. And they vary for a variety of reasons. They vary depending on whether I believe this is really as serious as, our public health officials are telling us that it is. But it also is about how serious is this to me? Am I someone who is at high risk or low risk? Am I someone who has the privilege of quarantining, or am I someone who isn't able to access that because of job kinds of reasons or responsibilities or things like that? So we know it's a threat, but the perceptions of what that means will vary for people. It's also one of these major life events that it is both a major life event and it's a daily hassle. And so what that means is our experience of stress at this time is both shared and individual. So why does that matter? The shared part is helpful. It helps us connect with other people. We know lots of other people might be going through some of the same things that we're going through, and that could make a big difference in terms of how I cope and how I respond. But we also know that there are, 1,000, a million individual responses. What this means for me personally is very different than what it might mean for you personally. And so at the same time that I have this sort of large scale event that I need to cope with, I also have the million small things that are happening because of this on a daily basis. And so that can make it more difficult. That could make the stress feel more isolating. That could make it harder to find ways to cope. So we're going to talk about both of those things. Obviously, this is a situation that has required significant and challenging ways of adaptation and adjustment and coping. These are not small changes that we've made. These are large-scale changes. They have large-scale impact. They have long-term impact in ways that we're not sure of. And that sense of unpredictability and not knowing all contribute to the experience that we have. So as we think about what we can do, and there's different things that different people can do in this situation, but when we think about what it means to cope with the stress, what we're talking about is management of our own physiological and cognitive and emotional responses. The downside of that is none of that necessarily changes the reality that we're in, right? I can have fabulous coping responses and we're still in the middle of a global pandemic. So this is not about changing an external sort of stressor or situation, but it is about changing my own response to that. So the question that Stuart asked me to talk about, he's like, you can talk about definitions if you want to, but we really need to know why we're buying all the toilet paper. And it really is an excellent question. So this is one of the things that you may have seen floating around on social media. I did not create this one, I shamelessly stole it. When we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Abraham Maslow was a psychologist who talked about we need to have our basic needs met before we can worry about what he talked about as higher level needs. And our basic needs are physiological and safety. Do I have shelter? Do I have food? Am I safe from harm? If those needs are satisfied, he said, we can then start to think about other kinds of higher level needs, love and belonging, esteem, self-actualization, things like that. But so one of the things that I think is helpful in trying to understand not just other people's buying behavior, but our own buying behavior, is that we are responding out of a sense of fear. And it's fear at a most basic level in terms of some of our most basic needs. So there's lots of information you can find about where this started and why this became an issue and all of those kinds of things. But the fact of the matter is, for most of us, having toilet paper feels like a really basic need, and we are afraid of not being able to have that. And we go to a store and we see that the toilet paper is not there, and that heightens that fear. That makes us feel more insecure. That makes us feel more unsafe. So, but part of what's happening here is that when I then go and buy all of the toilet paper that I can find, that only makes me feel better in the moment. And the question is, so why do I do that? And then why do I do it again tomorrow? And then why do I do it again on Thursday, right? And, one of the ways that we can understand that behavior for ourselves and for other people is that the reason that when we feel better when we do that, it's not actually the having of the toilet paper that makes us feel better. It does a little, but it's really the buying of the toilet paper that makes us feel better. I go to the store, I'm afraid I won't be able to get it, and then I can get it. And so what psychologists will tell you is that what you have done then is reinforce a very particular behavior. We don't think of our behavior that way. We think, I feel lousy and I feel afraid and I need to feel better, and now I feel better. But what makes me feel better is the buying. And so what happens then is having it isn't going to help me with that fear. It's the buying behavior. And so what gets reinforced is our purchasing, not our owning. It reduces the panic in the moment, but it actually contributes to a larger panic and a larger shortage. And I say that very sympathetically, right? The fear is real, the concern is real, and it becomes very hard to find other ways to manage that when we have something that feels so useful in doing that. So how are we going to manage the fear and the anxiety? Not just about toilet paper, but about all kinds of other things. And some of that is about recognition. So we're going to recognize that this is a major life event that has created ongoing daily stressors. And as much as there are some, times when we just kind of want to put our heads in the sand and not deal with that, it is actually the recognition that is the first step, because once I recognize what is going on, I have lots more options about how to respond to it. Part of our response to the stressor requires awareness of the need for not just short-term coping strategies, but long-term coping strategies. We like short-term coping strategies, and in a short-term stressful situation, they can work really well. But if some of our short-term coping strategies become long-term coping strategies, it contributes to that sense of exhaustion and depletion, and it ends up making us feel better and not worse. So part of the challenge in a situation like this is to build resilience. And how do we do that? There's two ways that we can start with that. One is shifting the perception of a situation from a threat to a challenge. And I want to stress that that is not about telling yourself a lie, that is not about trying to convince yourself of something that's not true. It's about finding ways to identify the strengths and the skills and the history that we all have of having coped with difficult situations before. Because again, it's not the reality that is contributing to that, it is my perception. If I feel like there is nothing I can do and I have no resources to bring, that is far more stressful than saying, okay, I have been in situations before, I have gotten through difficult situations, and I can face this as a challenge. It's also really important to recognize adaptive and maladaptive coping strategies. And I think that the key piece about that is about what works and what works without having significant downsides. And that is what makes something adaptive compared to a situation or a coping strategy being maladaptive. So what are we going to talk about with strategies for coping? We're going to think about how do we manage physiological responses? How do we manage cognitive responses? How do we manage emotional responses? And how do we figure out what are the pieces that I can control and what are the pieces that I can't? And as my colleagues will tell you, as someone who's much happier being in control of things than not being in control of things, that is a significant challenge and more of a challenge for some people. This is something else that's been floating around social media. I will tell you it's a little bit perkier than I am as a sort of in my individual response to things, but I like a lot of the content on here. It's hard to figure out what we can't control. I cannot control other people who are, outside gathering in large groups without wearing masks and, having lots of physical contact. I actually can't control the amount of toilet paper that is at the store. I don't know how long this will last. I have lots of people who have said to me, if I just knew when it would be done, if I knew it was May 1st, if I knew it was June 1st, even if I knew it was January 1st, I just need to know. And yeah, it's much nicer to know things than to not know things. And so the challenge is to sort of let go of that need to know. I can't control what other people do. I can't control what will happen and how other people will react. So what can I control? I can control my own attitude. And here it says my positive attitude, but it's not always possible to be positive. So I'm going to shoot for maybe something a little bit more reasonable. I can control my media exposure. I can control sort of my own behavior about following social recommendations. I can control my own sense of how I respond to other people, and we don't always control that perfectly, and sometimes how we treat other people gets a bit outside of our control, but it's always something I can come back to as a possibility. So I want to just cover each of those areas. When we talk about managing physiological responses, good nutrition is always better. Your body is going to respond more quickly, you're going to adapt more easily, you're going to feel physically better with good nutrition. Now, that does not mean you cannot, hypothetically, as I may or may not have done, go out and buy double stuffed Oreos the next time you go shopping. But I do want to make sure I'm not just eating double stuffed Oreos, right? I want to be able to practice good nutrition, be aware of what I'm eating. I want to make sure I'm getting sufficient sleep. And again, lots of our sleep is impacted by environmental circumstances beyond our control. Children, pets, phones ringing, other kinds of things. But I'm going to at least be mindful of it and make it a priority. For those of you who are parents and who are telling your kids to limit their screen time, this is a bit of a practice what we preach moment. And we really want to be aware of limiting our screen time, and especially at night. There's all this information out there about blue screens and how screen time actually changes our physiological response for sleep. And so less is more in that situation. We want to get fresh air and exercise will mean different things for different people. My exercise is probably a far more moderate and slow pace exercise than some of yours might be. I am not a runner. I've never been a runner, but even getting outside, walking a slow pace, a relaxed pace at safe social distance, whatever that means for you. As best we can, taking care of health and medical issues, right? So this is about kind of being aware of what those issues are, monitoring, being in touch with medical professionals as appropriate. It's also about limiting the use of alcohol and recreational drugs. And this goes back to my, my comment earlier about short-term coping versus long-term coping. What we know about alcohol, recreational drugs in moderation as short-term coping mechanisms can be very useful for people in various kinds of ways. But what we do know is that extended use, high levels of use start to impact our ability to bounce back and respond to stress. And even that kind of short-term impact that we might get is replaced very quickly by long-term problems with coping. So that's something to be aware of. And breathing, right? So breathing is one of those annoying things that people tell you to do. It's like someone telling you to relax, and we all can think internally about what our response is when people tell us to do that. But one of the things we know is that most of us kind of suck at breathing. We're not very aware of it. We're not very good at it. And that when we start to pay attention to it, we start to inhale a lot without exhaling a lot. And so what I will tell you about breathing is that the exhale is as important as the inhale, if not more important, in managing stress. But we also, so that's some of the ways that we can think about our physiology and have some control over our physiology. But I'm also going to think about how to manage my cognitive responses. And if you are a worrier, I am talking to you, and I am talking to you as someone who understands and can go there very quickly. So part of what managing my cognitive responses do is that the way I think about things impacts the way I feel. And so the challenge then is oftentimes it feels like our thoughts can get away from us. And the challenge is to think about what are some of the ways that we can reasonably and effectively control our cognition and our cognitive responses. So some of the ways to do that is to practice information literacy, to know your sources, to not go by the headlines. And I'm certainly guilty of having done that before, but to really be sort of thoughtful and critical about the information that is coming our way, and not necessarily to believe everything we're seeing without some thought and some research. It's also, and especially in times like this, it's about limiting news and media exposure. So we want to know what's going on. We want to hear that information. And so, you know, we will often go to the news in order to find that in various news sources. But be aware of what your response is to that. Trust that if there is news you need to know, someone is going to tell you what that is and share that with you, and you don't need to be constantly monitoring that 24 hours a day. Limiting time on social media is the same thing. You know, my students will start to roll their eyes when we talk about this because they are expecting you kids today on your smartphones and with your Snapchat. But what we know is that this is most of us at this point. This is not limited to youth. This is not limited to teenagers or college students. That most of us who are on any type of social media are spending significant amounts of time. And pre-pandemic, most of us used our phones and social media as a go-to when we were bored, and as a go-to when there was downtime, and as a go-to to manage stress and anxiety and distract ourselves. So we might see that lots of that is increasing for people at times like this, and finding ways to decrease it, to be aware of your response to it, to be aware of, you know, what feels helpful about social media and what doesn't feel helpful. In terms of being able to see this as a challenge, we want to be able to recognize prior successful coping. Everyone has been through stressful times in their life. Everyone has gotten through those stressful times in various ways. And so finding ways to remind yourself of having what you did personally, internally, or externally to get through a stressful situation will help you mobilize. Even if those same skills are not necessarily the exact skills you need right now, they will help you mobilize and figure out and plan and respond in a different kind of way. And that's about recognizing what your skills are, what your strengths are, what your resources are, internal and external. You know, it's also about reality testing. And reality testing is tricky in times of stress. And so I don't know how many of you have allergies. I have allergies. I've had allergies my whole life, which means that I cough, right? That's what happens in the spring. I'm allergic to trees. The trees are blooming. They look fantastic, and they are making me cough. And when that started up, I had to really kind of take a step back and look at, this is something that I do. This is something that I do in the spring. I know what this kind of cough feels like. And to sort of remind myself of, you know, what am I worried about, but what is actually happening right now? Stepping back from your thoughts, easier said than done. And so one of the things that our social psychology colleagues will remind us is that we cannot decide we are not going to think about something. As soon as someone tells you not to think about something, you start thinking about it. If I said to you, this is the classic example, don't think about a white bear, you are now all thinking about a white bear, and you are, don't lie, we know that you are, right? So I can't just decide I'm not going to think about this. I can't decide that I'm not going to worry, but I can take a step back and try to look at my thoughts rather than look through my thoughts. So rather than sort of, having the same kind of worrisome or ruminative thought over and over and over again and being caught up in that, which is very easy to do, I can try to sort of realize that I'm thinking that and kind of have a, oh yes, I see I'm thinking that again. And to get a little bit of sort of internal distance from the thought to feel a little bit less controlled by it. The other piece of it, and this is sort of ironic, is you need to provide time to worry. There are lots of things to worry about. We all know that someone telling you don't worry and relax is not effective. So give yourself some time, right? Allow some time to worry. Set a timer. You could use your phone, set your phone, worry for 10 minutes. And then once the 10 minutes is up, make a conscious choice to say to yourself internally, I'm not going to think about that right now. I will come back to it later. It's a real kind of difference between putting a response kind of on a shelf versus pushing it in the closet and shoving the closet door. And those of you who have closets, like I have closets, know that once you shove enough things in the closet, at some point the closet kind of spills open. But if I give myself permission and time to think about the things that are concerning me and to be able to kind of come back and forth to them, that helps me contain the thought and contain the anxiety as opposed to avoid it. And we know that the containment works better. And then I'm going to accept and manage my emotional responses. Accepting emotions in the moment is incredibly difficult, especially when they're negative. If I'm feeling great, I have no problem accepting that in the moment for the most part. But when I'm feeling sad, when I'm feeling worried, when I'm feeling panicked, when I'm feeling angry, those are harder emotions to sit with. But if we can sit with them, one of the things that we can notice is that they change. Sometimes they don't change quite as quickly as we would like them to, but they certainly are going to change. It's important in managing our sense of fear and anxiety and stress to understand the difference between worry and problem solving. And when I worry about something over and over and over and over again, that starts to become sort of cyclical and it feels like I'm doing something. Worrying feels really productive. If I'm a high school student and I'm worrying about getting into college and I worry and I worry and I worry and then I get into college, what I have learned is that the worrying makes things happen. Now, of course, the worrying doesn't make things happen, but this is sort of being able to catch ourselves in that kind of worry loop and remember that this is sort of not as productive and not as sort of effective as it feels like it is. I want to find the balance in a situation that is real life scary, like a pandemic. It's scary, and not being afraid is not necessarily something that is possible for many of us or most of us at this time. But I want to find a balance. I want to not be in a state of panic where I'm sort of immobilized and can't respond the way I need to. And I don't want to be in a state of denial either. That's about kind of finding that middle ground, which is prudent behavior. How can I be cautious? How can I be reasonable? But how can I still kind of move through my life the way that I need to? It's also a time to recognize and accept feelings of pain and loss and to really feel entitled to those feelings. We've talked with this a lot with our college students, especially our seniors. We've talked with it about our incoming college students, our seniors in high school who are, starting this process. And one of the things we know is that there's a lot of loss associated with this that sort of traverses all levels. So of course there is large scale loss. And when there is large scale loss, when there is illness and fear and people, dying of this, it is very hard to feel entitled to feeling bad because you didn't get your high school graduation. But the fact of the matter is there's not a set amount of pain to go around, unfortunately. That would be great if there were. But I can be both aware that there's a large scale crisis and that I might be very fortunate to be relatively safe in this moment and still feel really sad and really angry about the things that I have lost because of this. And so being able to accept where you are with that, I think, is important, and accept where the people in your life are. Mindfulness is sort of that go-to word right now, right? This is in the last few years. Anytime you turn on a news show or a talk show or open up a newspaper, we're talking about behaving mindfully. It's actually, it's a little cliche at this point, but it's actually really effective. There's lots of data on the way that mindfulness helps us with all kinds of negative feelings. What we actually mean by mindfulness is a non-judgmental awareness and acceptance. And so that is about sort of being aware of how I feel in the moment, of recognizing it, of not judging myself positively or negatively. And again, I'm going to kind of note the fluidity. I'm going to watch things change, note how I'm feeling, and be able to step back from it. We do know that connecting with other people is important, and besides the very real physiological risks that the coronavirus has caused for us, it has also cut out most of our social support. So we might still have family. That might be a good thing, that might not be a good thing. I'll talk about that in a minute too. But the challenge is to figure out, how do I connect with other people, and how do I connect with other people at safe social distance? You know, underscoring that safe social distance is not the same as being able to really engage and talk and touch people who we care about and who are important to us. So how do we do that? We do it by phone calls, we do it by text, we do it by FaceTime apps, we do it by all kinds of things that let us get some of that important social connection. And then the last two things are really about identifying and using the supports that are out there. I'm gonna provide some resources at the end that Stuart will make available also, I think, in the chat. But what are the social supports I have? Who are the people in my life who are supportive? Who are the professionals in my life are supportive? You know, what do I need when and from whom, and what do I not need, right? So part of this is about being able to reach out to people who can be helpful to us, but also being able to say to a family member or a friend, you know what, I actually don't want to hear the latest statistics. That's not helpful to me right now. Let's talk about something else, right? So being able to ask for what you need and ask for what you want, and also being able to be clear about what's not helpful to you in the moment. It's really important right now to underscore that home is not safe for everyone. It's not safe, it's not comfortable. And so quarantine means very, very different things for people depending on their circumstances. So this is one of the resources that have been going out in various places. And I do want to underscore that this is a very real phenomenon, that people who are professionals around intimate partner violence and you know, issues around that have a lot of resources and ways to help people stay as safe as they can. So that information is here for you as well. And then finally, this is the cartoon that I show my students at the beginning of every semester and at the end of every semester. And they roll their eyes at the beginning and they roll their eyes a little bit less at the end. But I love this cartoon. It's really about self-compassion. It is about being kind with ourselves and gentle with ourselves. And you know, we can't always make the monster go away, but we can absolutely sit down and offer it some tea and see if that helps shift some of our coping. So that is the information I have. These are the resources that are available to you. I believe if we can put some of those in into the chat, that there's some live links here that will work. But I also, just to have this, if you sort of take a screenshot of this or whatever, if you Google these things, you should be able to find the information, even if the links are not live in what you're looking at. So, so thank you very much. Thank you for being here with me. I hope that some of this information is useful, and I hope that you will give yourself some credit for having gotten this far and doing the best you can, and know that there's some resources out there. So, so if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'm happy to try to answer them.
Thank you, Professor. And yes, those links, I can find a way to have that in the story that we end up posting on Drew's website, so we make sure that those are available. Like you said, people can certainly, this will be up on YouTube if they need to take a screenshot and Google them, that works too. So you've already answered, obviously, my question, which was about the toilet paper hoarding. So I'll get to all the less important ones now. And people feel free to send them in via the chat. One first question is, what are the challenges of an eventual return to normalcy?
You know, I think part of the challenges are similar to the not knowing when this will be done, right? Part of the fantasy in our heads right now is when this is done, we will go back to normal. And I think what we're going to find is that it's not going to be an abrupt return. To some extent, we had a little bit of a lead time into the quarantine that we're currently in right now, but it was fairly abrupt, actually. We kind of watched things happen, watched other countries do some things, and then all of a sudden we decided we needed to shut down, right? It felt fairly abrupt. I don't think the return to normal will be as abrupt, and that's sort of unfortunate, right? We would love an abrupt return to normal where we all go about our days. I think one of the things that we're going to be aware of is that the new normal for a really long time is going to be very different than our old normal. I don't know how many people are having the experience I'm having where I watch a television show, like a fictional television show, and someone goes to hug someone and I'm like, stop, don't touch them, right? So that we have this, like we have a vigilant response that is really different right now. There's some things that are okay about that, right? I mean, there's things that maybe we need to be doing differently in this environment moving into the future. So I think it's going to be it's going to take some time for the anxiety and the fear to start to subside even when the situation becomes safer. And so I think that as we approach whatever that new normal looks like, it's going to be important to really be monitoring. Is this something that I'm legitimately concerned about? Is this a situation that really is unsafe? And how do I start to be aware of and trust information about things being safe and start to be able to interact in ways that right now feel particularly risky? So I think it's going to be possible. I think awareness of information and our own internal responses will help that. But I do think it's going to be an adjustment.
Thank you. So next question. The question says, I've noticed an escalation in negative responses. For example, when I was once mildly impatient, I'm now irritable. What was once irritable, I'm now angry. And then kind of steamrolls from there. Is this normal, and how can somebody respond to this?
Yeah, so yes, me too. And I think that, the term that we often use in psychology is ego depleted. And the lay definition of that is I'm just done, right? I have nothing left. And so, when we are feeling a little bit more enriched by our lives, when we are feeling less stressed, less tired, less worried, when we have more of our health and safety needs met, and we can start to think about these other things, I'm far more patient with my students and my son and my dogs and, well, maybe not my dogs, but you'd have to meet my dogs to understand that. But it's the idea that we're just low on resources. And if you think back to some of that information about our physiological responses, we are actually low on resources. It's not just I'm not as nice as I used to be. It's that my hormones and my endorphins and all kinds of things are just not functioning the way they normally are because they are depleted by this time of stress. I do think that, again, self-care is a close second to mindfulness in terms of one of those words we throw around. Self-care is really important. And again, that means different things for different people. If you are a primary caregiver and working at home and have small children and have, adults in your life who you are taking care of, someone saying, oh, go take an hour walk and take a bubble bath. And, there's sort of an internal response like, okay, well, how do I do that? So it really is about finding even very small moments of managing our physiology and managing our emotional responses and managing our cognitive responses. And I don't say that lightly, and I don't say like that's easy at the best of times, let alone in times like this. But I do think being aware that the response is normal, is appropriate, is grounded not just sort of in our heads, but in our bodies, and finding ways to start making small shifts to take care of some of those needs and find some respite will help with managing frustration and feeling intolerant and feeling stressed.
Thank you. Then we have another here who works in a live theater field and asked about having the responsibility of having people wearing masks. What does that sort of responsibility look like, and how do you, what are ways that you can go about approaching that responsibility and actually having to tell people how to essentially behave?
Yeah, my students will tell you one of my favorite things to say is if people just did what I told them to, everything would be fine. And then I tell them that I'm joking, and then I tell them that I'm not really joking because I actually think that that's true a lot of the time. And I think that when we see situations like this is part about controlling other people's behavior, right? It's being able to set those boundaries, and how do we enforce those boundaries safely and effectively? And we're hearing all kinds of news stories about store employees and restaurant employees being harassed and yelled at and assaulted when they are asking people to engage in the basic public health behaviors that we've all been asked to engage in at this point. I think that one of the ways that can help that, and again, in a live theater situation, if this is about, there's probably a difference between talking to your employees versus talking to eventual theater goers, right? Or sort of dealing with the public. But letting people know in advance what the expectations are, letting people know in advance what the consequences are for violating those expectations, and finding ways to kind of safely and holding people safely and firmly holding people accountable, right? And again, I know that that's sort of, there's 1,000 situations where we could say, well, yes, but that wouldn't work because of X, and I don't dispute the reality of that. But I do think that the clearer we can be about not just expectations, but consequences. You know, if I own a restaurant and you come in without a mask, I will not be able to let you in. I will not be able to give you your takeout. I will not be able to serve you. And to be able to kind of give people that information in advance, once I have drawn the line in the sand, it's easier to point to the line, right? And so having as much information as possible in advance can help manage that situation.
Thank you. And then another, will there be longer term psychological effects once things return to normal? And will we all have some sort of a PTSD regarding this experience?
So yes, and sort of. And so I'll explain what that means. I mean, long-term stress has consequences, and those consequences are going to be individual. When we talk about PTSD, when we talk about it in sort of a casual, you know, sort of layperson kind of term, what we really mean by that when we're using it more casually is, will I have some kind of long-term response, delayed response, after the fact response to a traumatic event? And the answer is yeah, we will. In terms of clinical diagnosis, PTSD is actually a very specific set of symptoms that not everybody who experiences trauma exhibits those particular symptoms. So some of the symptoms associated with PTSD are a sense of hypervigilance, a sort of you know, diminished affect, or kind of a dissociative experience kind of thing. There's lots of symptoms associated with it. But I think to answer what I think is the real question is, we're going to have responses to this, and it's going to take us time to figure out what those responses are, how to manage them, and when it's safe to let them go, right? The reason we have something like hypervigilance, or that kind of constant looking over our shoulders, you know, literally or figuratively after a trauma, is because there's a sense that that will keep me safe. If I can see the danger coming, if I can stay vigilant, everything will be fine. And sometimes in a dangerous situation, there's reasons to do that. The problem is when I stay hypervigilant when the situation is no longer dangerous. And the downside of that is if I'm constantly in a state of vigilance, I cannot actually very easily determine a safe situation from a dangerous situation. And one of the things I want to be able to do is to have that reality testing in place where I can say, okay, this is really dangerous, and I'm going to be vigilant and not go in there. And this feels scary and anxiety provoking to me, but I actually know it's safe, and I have my mask, and, you know, whatever those pieces are. And so I think that it's going to be about watching our responses, watching how they change, but also being able to hold our responses up as new information comes in about what we need to do. It's okay to be afraid, and it's okay to be anxious, and it's okay to be sad. I want to be able to have those feelings and still be able to be functional in the ways I need to be functional.
And here I'm actually going to combine two questions that seem to be somewhat similar. One is, I see a lot of people doing puzzles, learning languages, going outside, picking up new hobbies in this time. How do I get to a point where it feels okay to cope in a way that might not be as Instagrammable? And then another that kind of dovetails from this is, do you have suggestions for parents whose teenagers seem otherwise fine but are not getting outside for fresh air or exercise, even though they've always been very active and into sports? I just can't seem to get them into getting outside. Schoolwork and social texting and binge watching stuff is all they seem to be doing.
Yeah, and I think that I will just put it out there. I have picked up no new hobbies. I have developed no new skills. My language skills are as problematic as they ever were. I cannot sew. I cannot paint. You know, all of that. I can't even do a puzzle because my work is all over my dining room table. So there's this sort of, you know, there's this lore out there, oh, isn't this wonderful time to develop new skills? I'm like, yeah, go for it if you can. But it's not necessarily possible for everyone. It's certainly not attainable for everyone. And it's not necessary for everyone, right? If that is something that you can do that helps you feel better, fantastic. If that is something that you are too depleted to even consider, me too, right there with you. So I think it really is about kind of being aware of what you're at and what you need and not holding yourself to an unreasonable expectation. I think that the challenge for teenagers and adolescents and children is the same challenge we are all experiencing, but it's heightened in a lot of ways. It is a time we know developmentally where peers are incredibly important, where social interaction with peers really outweighs the importance in terms of what used to be social interaction with family or siblings. And it's a real loss. It's absolutely a loss. So at the same time, where I do think limiting social media in terms of the screens is important for health reasons, it is actually also important to have conversations with your children and your teens and your adolescents about what they need, what they're getting from that, and especially if this is in some sense about actual face-to-face interaction with the people who they cannot be spending time with right now. Some of those resources at the end on that last slide, can I see if I can pull that up again? Much as I love my monster, let's see, yeah. There's actually some information on here about from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network about helping children and adolescents cope. And I think that we want to sort of find the line between, relaxing some rules where it makes sense and where that is feasible, and also making sure that basic physical needs and physiological needs are being met, and also that they have multiple ways of coping, right? If Sean is the person I call when I'm stressed, that's great as long as Sean can pick up the phone. Not that anyone makes phone calls anymore, but you know what I mean. But if that's my only resource and Sean's not there when I call, I have nothing else. And so we want to make sure that parents are helping kids build up a sort of a toolkit of coping rather than just having one or two methods. And the other thing is that, like the rest of us, our adolescents are feeling depressed and anxious and angry. Sometimes we're better than our adolescents at dealing with those feelings. Sometimes we're not, right? But I think also reaching out for, additional resources, physicians, therapists, crisis lines, whatever it is, to be able to help assess that, if this is sort of a really lousy long-term situation, or if these are situations where the feelings that teenagers are having, or any of us are having, are something that requires more systematic intervention.
Thank you. And then we have another one here. How do we balance or prioritize stressors on multiple fronts like school, jobs, family, health, finances, etc.? Yeah.
Until you got to some of the end of that list, I had an easy answer, but it's a problem, right? I mean, so what is, if you think about, again, that kind of hierarchy of needs, safety and health, are the most critical, but sometimes those are in conflict, right? How do I work and take care of my children? How do I keep social distance and still be able to do my job if I'm lucky enough to still have a job at this point, right? I think it is really about recognizing the situation we're in, recognizing that there are some things that are going to be, some needs that we have or some responsibilities that we have that are going to be unmet, that, whatever that might mean in terms of, sticking your kid in front of the TV for longer than you ever thought you would, or, I'm going to try for nutritional meals in my house, but sometimes it's a frozen pizza because that's sort of the best we can do. That there's going to be a give and take, that there's going to be, in this situation, there's probably always going to be something that we think that we should be doing that we are not going to be able to do. And to just acknowledge that and let it go and remind ourselves that we're really doing the best we can with the resources we have, and being aware of how to reach out for additional resources when we need them.
Okay, we got a new one that just came in. Any suggestions for processing some of the positive thoughts coming out of this experience? For example, memories of the little things from the past that are coming up.
Yeah, it can actually feel uncomfortable to have positive thoughts right now. There's, again, as I tell you to limit social media, you'll notice I make a lot of reference to things that are going on social media. But, we've seen some of those things about sort of what this is like for introverts, right? Or what this is like for pet owners or whatever it is. I had a colleague say to me, like, I feel like I've been preparing for this my whole life. I'm good. I'm in. I'm doing my job. I'm doing what I need to. And, for a lot of people, we're certainly seeing this actually with children and adolescents who have a lot of social anxiety. There's huge relief at being home and being in a place that feels more safe and more secure for some people, and not having to do some of those things. So it's okay. It is okay to feel how you are feeling, and that might change radically from moment to moment. You can have It is possible to feel happy and sad at the same time. These are, we have these emotions that can exist side by side. And I think that it's important not to feel guilty about things that feel good right now. I think that this is a time where we take what we can get for what feels good, and as long as it is adaptive and not hurting ourselves or someone else, it's important to embrace that. Absolutely.
And it looks like we have one more here, unless any more come in as you're answering. Do you think this will cause an increase in pharmacological support after going through all this?
People feel very differently about psychopharmacology. And I will say that my personal opinion is that it's important for us to be healthy and to feel better and to be able to function and do the work we need to do, whether that is sort of work out in the workplace or work at home or sort of internal kinds of things. I think that with appropriate guidance and support from medical professionals, I think that what is most important is that people take care of themselves. I don't know if there will be sort of an increase or a go-to in pharmacology over other kinds of things. And I would say about prescribed medication, the same thing I would say about recreational. It's important to be aware, it's important to monitor, it's important to make sure that the benefits are outweighing the side effects. But it's lots of people will say, oh, that's sort of a crutch, or I can pull myself up by my bootstraps, and other cliched kinds of things. What is most important is that we are healthy and we are safe and we are taking care of ourselves and we're feeling better. And that's going to mean different things for different people, and that's okay.
Thank you. It looks like that's all the questions that we have. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us, and thank you, Professor, for your presentation. A reminder that this presentation will be uploaded to YouTube probably tomorrow and put on Drew's website if you would like to go through either the presentation or Professor's talk, or just print out the monster cartoon, or use any of these resources. So thank you so much, Professor, and we'll see everybody back here when we have the next Ask the Experts. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.